The silence in the main conference room of Erie Industrial Systems was heavy, physical, and suffocating. It was the terrified silence of 200 employees holding their breath simultaneously. I sat in the third row, my hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee that was still warm. I stared at the curling steam because looking up meant facing the pity of the junior developers I had mentored and the shock of shift managers I had known for decades. Standing at the podium was Gerald Hoffman, the chief executive officer. He was a man I had once considered a friend, a man I had spent freezing weekends with in server rooms to ensure the company never lost a single penny during network outages. But that friendship evaporated the moment he stepped to the microphone. Gerald announced that as part of a strategic restructuring, Henry Vance would be transitioning out of his role as Senior Information Technology Director, effective immediately. Transitioning out. It was a bloodless phrase for destroying a career. I was 54 years old. I had been with the company since I was 26, fresh out of the Army with a computer science degree. Gerald claimed the department required a fresh perspective, digital natives that understood modern cloud-first paradigms. Standing next to him, wearing an expensive suit and a smug grin, was Mason Hoffman, Gerald's 28-year-old son. Mason had been at the company for exactly 6 months under the vague title of Technology Strategy Consultant. This was not a restructuring. It was a coronation. Gerald announced Mason as the new director. Mason nodded like a politician. Avoiding my eyes, I felt sick. Gerald could have fired me in private on a Friday afternoon. Instead, he chose the Monday morning all-hands meeting to humiliate me, signaling that loyalty meant nothing compared to bloodlines. I stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. 200 heads turned as I walked out. Gerald's voice faltered before continuing his speech. I walked into the hallway, feeling the betrayal like a physical blow. I had built this place, and they were throwing me out like obsolete hardware. I had spent 28 years of my life pouring my energy, my passion, and my health into this company. I had seen it grow from a small local firm into a major industrial supplier. To be discarded in such a public, theatrical manner was not just a professional setback, it was a deeply personal insult. I could feel the heat of my anger rising, but I forced myself to keep my composure. I refused to give Gerald the satisfaction of seeing me break down or lose my temper in front of the colleagues who had respected me for years. The walk to my office was lonely. The fluorescent lights overhead, which I had scheduled for an energy-saving upgrade to save 12% next month, buzzed mockingly. At my office, Diane Wells from Human Resources was waiting with a young security guard named Charlie. Charlie, whom I had helped set up a virtual private network for his classes, could not meet my eyes. Diane looked close to tears. She had been here almost as long as I had and knew this was a hit job. She told me they wanted me out in 30 minutes. I unfolded the cardboard boxes she handed me. I looked at the photos of my kids. Sophia was smiling in her graduation gown. Daniel looked proud in his hospital white coat. Panic set in. Sophia had a year left of graduate school, costing $40,000 annually. Daniel was a medical resident, working 80 hours a week, and I helped with his student loans. Plus, I had the mortgage from my divorce with Linda 3 years ago. I needed this job. I was exactly 3 years and 4 months away from retirement. If I reached 57 years and 4 months, I would receive a full pension and medical coverage. Gerald knew this and fired me to save money. Deanne asked for my laptop, phone, and access badge. I undocked the machine that let me monitor every server and database and handed it over along with the phone. But when she asked for the badge, I hesitated. Tucked in my wallet, the badge was a radio frequency identification card with root access clearance. It was also the key to a failsafe I had written 3 years ago. I had built a dead man's switch. The system verified the status of the primary administrator account. If my account status was set to terminated in the Human Resources database, a script would trigger a 72-hour countdown. This delay allowed time to correct database errors, but if the timer reached 0 without an administrator override, the system would enter a total lockdown. Deanne was waiting. I lied smoothly, telling her I left the card in my car cup holder. She felt guilty enough to let me go, marking it as return pending delivery. She had no idea about the logic gates and dependencies that held their world together. I finished packing my box and walked to the garage. Tucking the badge into my pocket, I looked back at the building. I had built the locks, and Gerald had just thrown away the only person with the key. To understand why this betrayal cut so deep, you have to understand what Erie Industrial Systems used to be. When I started in 1996, it was just me, a screwdriver, and a tangled mess of cables in a closet. We had 4 computers and a jamming fax machine. I built everything myself, running cables through ceilings and sleeping on a cot in the break room to reboot servers every 2 hours. I wrote the custom scripts that integrated our inventory with the manufacturing floor, code that still ran deep in the system today. I remembered the ice storm of 2014. The power grid failed and the plant generators died. I drove 40 miles on icy roads to get to the office, siphoning gas from my truck to keep the server room running. I stayed for 3 days, manually cycling fans to prevent database overheating. Gerald had hugged me with tears in his eyes, giving me an award and telling everyone that as long as Henry Vance was here, the company was safe. Apparently, safety was no longer a priority. Now modernization was the goal, and it had a name. Mason Hoffman. I tried to be nice to Mason when he arrived 6 months ago. I thought the boss's son wanted to learn, but Mason only wanted to lecture us. He sat in meetings, tapping his digital tablet, interrupting senior network engineers with nonsense about leveraging blockchain for supply chain latency. My lead engineer, Rebecca, corrected him, explaining that latency was a network speed issue, not a blockchain thing. Mason dismissed her, insisting we needed to be cloud native. He did not understand that the cloud was just someone else's computer, and that moving manufacturing data to a public server without encryption was corporate suicide. But Gerald loved it because it sounded modern and cheap. Gerald stopped inviting me to planning lunches 3 months ago. Then he asked me to give Mason read-only access. Finally, last month, he asked me to mentor Mason. He told me to show him the legacy stuff. That is what he called 28 years of engineering. I tried to explain network switches and the command line interface, but Mason laughed, asking if there was an app or a dashboard instead. He called the text interface archaic and demanded a graphical user interface. He was like a toddler looking at a plane cockpit and complaining about the lack of cartoons. Now he was flying the plane. Unemployment is a strange purgatory. I woke up at 6 in the morning out of habit on Tuesday. I sat at my dining table, staring at oatmeal and my professional networking profile. I was 54, and the job market had changed. The listings required languages and container systems I had never used. The gatekeepers were algorithms that filtered out anyone who graduated before the smartphone era. But my mind kept returning to the timer ticking in the basement of Erie Industrial Systems. I needed to know what Mason was doing. If he brought in outside help, they might spot my dormant script. I needed eyes on the inside. I texted Julian in procurement, asking to buy him a beer at 6 in the evening. Julian and I played poker every month, and he hated the company's new direction. We met at O'Malley's, a local dive bar. Julian looked exhausted. He told me the office was a madhouse and morale was in the toilet. He said Mason's transition was a comedy sketch. Mason spent the morning trying to sync his email signature and could not get the projector to work. He even asked the staff for the Wi-Fi password. I drank my beer to hide my smile. Julian mentioned the Bradley presentation on Thursday morning. Gerald was frantic, betting the entire company on this $25 million contract. Julian said Mason was nervous and tried to hire a vendor named TechServe to audit the systems, but he messed up the cost codes on the purchase order, delaying them until Wednesday afternoon. I asked if Mason had changed the admin passwords. Julian laughed, saying Mason was using my old login from a sticky note on his monitor that read admin123. He thought it was the master password, but it was just a local user password with no control over the core infrastructure. I told Julian I left a system that requires a competent administrator, and if they did not have one, that was not my fault. Julian took a long draw from his glass and looked at me with deep concern. "Henry, you have to be careful," he warned. "Gerald is looking for someone to blame for the chaos, and if the Bradley presentation goes poorly, he might try to scapegoat you." I nodded, understanding the warning. I knew Gerald's habits well. Whenever something went wrong, he never accepted responsibility. He always looked for a subordinate to take the fall. But this time, there was no paper trail that could link me to the system's failure. I had followed every protocol, documented every change, and left the network in perfect operating condition when I was escorted out of the building. The impending lockdown was not a bug or a hack. It was the natural consequence of removing the only authorized administrator without completing the mandatory handoff procedures. Wednesday morning arrived. I spent the hours doing yard work, raking leaves and cleaning gutters to quiet my mind. My phone buzzed with recruiter messages, but I ignored them. At 2 in the afternoon, Mason called. His voice lacked the arrogant bluster he had displayed on Monday. He was panicked. He said he was trying to access the Detroit project files for the Bradley presentation, but the folder was empty. I smiled. The files were on an encrypted partition. I told him he needed to mount the drive using the key in the manual in the physical archives in the basement, Box 4, year 2012. Mason was horrified by the dusty basement and asked me to just tell him the code. I refused, explaining that my clearance was revoked and sharing it would violate the non-disclosure agreement. Mason begged, saying his father would kill him. I told him I was a civilian now, and if I gave him the code and something went wrong, I could face legal action. I hung up. There was no manual in Box 4, just old cables and a broken coffee maker. The wild goose chase would buy me time. I reviewed the logic of the countdown in my mind. The 72-hour timer was a security failsafe I wrote 3 years ago. The script checked the human resources database every hour. If the primary administrator was terminated, it initiated the countdown. This delay allowed time to correct database errors. But if the timer reached 0 without an administrator override, the system assumed a breach and initiated Protocol 0. Under Protocol 0, the system would sever its external virtual private network connections, shut down its portals, and encrypt the databases with a 64-character key, known only to me. The screens would display a bright red warning of administrative lockdown. The company's operations would grind to a halt. The email would stop, phones would go dead, and the automated assembly lines would halt. The only way to unlock it was to enter the 64-character key manually in the server room. My termination was processed on Monday morning at 9:15. 72 hours later would be Thursday morning at 9:15. The Bradley presentation was scheduled for 9 in the morning on Thursday. The timing was absolute perfection. I spent the rest of Wednesday relaxing, watching a movie and cooking a quiet dinner. It was strange not checking the server status or responding to late-night alerts, but the detachment felt healthy. For 28 years, my life had been dictated by the heartbeat of Erie Industrial Systems. I had missed school plays, anniversaries, and family dinners because a switch failed or a database crashed. Now the responsibility belonged to someone else. I looked at the wall calendar in the dining room. Tomorrow, the price for Gerald's arrogance would come due. I woke up occasionally during the night, thinking about the servers. It was like phantom limb syndrome. My brain kept expecting a page, but the phone stayed silent. I knew the code was solid. I had tested it dozens of times in simulated environments. It was clean, elegant, and uncompromising. It did not care about corporate titles or family bloodlines. It only cared about logic. If the logical conditions were met, the gates would close, and no amount of screaming from Gerald would open them. I checked the backup systems one last time in my mind. The entire server farm was housed in the basement of the main building, and it was cooled by 3 massive air conditioning units that I had installed. The systems were designed to fail over to local storage if they lost connection to the main network, ensuring that no data was lost during the lockdown. It was a complete, self-contained containment strategy. If they wanted their data back, they would have to come to me. I sat on my back porch, watching the wind rustle through the oak trees, and thought about the years I had sacrificed for Erie Industrial Systems. I remembered missing Sophia's 10th birthday party because a critical database server had crashed in the middle of the night. I remembered spending Thanksgiving in the freezing server room, eating cold turkey from a plastic container, while my family celebrated at home. Those were the sacrifices that eventually led to my divorce from Linda. I had prioritized the company's survival over my own personal happiness, believing that my loyalty would be rewarded in the end. Gerald's betrayal was a harsh reminder that in the corporate world, loyalty is a one-way street. I pulled out my personal tablet and looked at my offline copy of the system documentation. The architecture was a work of art, a complex ecosystem of load balancers, database clusters, and security firewalls that I had designed and implemented over 2 decades. Mason had called it archaic because it did not have a modern, colorful dashboard with flashing graphs. He did not understand that the simplicity of the command line interface was what made it secure. It did not have the vulnerabilities that came with web-based management tools. It was built for stability and security, not for showing off to investors. I also thought about my kids. Sophia was working so hard on her graduate studies, and Daniel was giving everything he had to his medical residency. They were good kids, and they deserved a father who could support them. I was not going to let Gerald rob them of their future to line his own pockets. The $40,000 a year for Sophia's tuition and the monthly payments for Daniel's student loans were commitments I was determined to keep, no matter what. If I had to become an independent consultant and charge $450 an hour to do it, then that is exactly what I would do. Thursday morning arrived, gray and overcast. I woke up at 5 in the morning, unable to sleep. I got dressed and drove to the Daily Grind, the diner across the street from Erie Industrial Systems. I sat in a window booth, ordered coffee and eggs, and watched the building. At 7 in the morning, catering trucks arrived with platters of sandwiches and hot coffee. Gerald was sparing no expense. At 7:30, Mason's Porsche pulled in. He was driving too fast, looking disheveled as he carried a stack of papers. At 8 in the morning, black sports utility vehicles brought the Bradley automotive team. Gerald met them at the door, laughing too loudly. I could see the desperation in his body language. At 8:45 in the morning, I saw movement in the second-floor conference room. They were gathering. The presentation was scheduled to start at 9 in the morning. Around 9:15, Mason would fire up the system for the live demonstration. My phone sat silent on the table. At 9 in the morning, the show began. At 9:14, my phone buzzed with a text message from Julian. They are starting. Mason looks like he is going to throw up. He could not find the manual you talked about in the basement. He is winging it. I stared at the second hand on my watch. Tick, tick, tick. 9:15 arrived. In the server room across the street, the script reached 0. It checked the database, saw user Henry Vance was terminated, and initiated protocol 0. At 9:17, Gerald called. I let it go to voicemail. At 9:19, he called again. I answered. Hello, Gerald, I said. Henry, thank God. Gerald screeched. You need to help us. The system has gone crazy. Gerald, I asked, finding confusion. Why are you calling me? I thought I was transitioned out. We are in the middle of the presentation, he yelled. Mason tried to launch the simulation and the screen went red. It says administrative lockdown. Nothing works. The email is down. The phones are dead. The manufacturing line just stopped. The Bradley guys are staring at us. Sounds like a security protocol, I said. Did someone trigger an unauthorized access event? I do not know, Gerald screamed. Mason is clicking everything and nothing is working. Well, if the primary administrator account is terminated, the system locks down to prevent hacking, I explained. It is a safety feature I built. Remember after the payroll incident? Fix it. Turn it off, Gerald demanded. I cannot do that, Gerald. I am not an employee. If I access your system now without a contract, your board could sue me under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, Title 18, Section 1030 of the United States Code for unauthorized computer access. I am a civilian, and I am currently having breakfast. Hank, please, Gerald cried, using my old nickname. I am telling you to fix it, and I am telling you, Gerald, that I do not work for you, I said, my voice hardening. You fired me publicly to get a fresh perspective. Maybe Mason can unlock it. In the background, I heard a Bradley executive say, Mr. Hoffman, if you cannot run a demonstration, how can we trust you with our production line? This is amateur hour. Gerald's voice trembled. Henry, please, name your price, I smiled. My emergency rate for critical system recovery is $450 an hour, minimum 8 hours, paid in advance via wire transfer. And I need a signed consulting agreement that indemnifies me of all liability. $450? Gerald shrieked. That is extortion. That is the market rate for expert institutional knowledge, I replied. Pay it, or explain to Bradley Automotive why they just wasted their morning. Fine, he shouted. I will wire the money. Just get over here. I am across the street, I said. I will be there in 5 minutes. Have the paperwork ready. I hung up, finished my coffee, and left a $20 tip. I stood up, buttoned my jacket, and walked out of the diner. The walk across the street was different this time. I was not the man walking to his execution. I was the expert coming to clean up their mess. I entered the lobby, where the receptionist looked at me with wide, panicked eyes, and I simply nodded and headed for the elevator. The coffee in my paper cup had been hot and bitter, but it helped keep me grounded. I watched the minutes tick by on my watch. 8:50, 8:55, 9 o'clock. The door of the diner opened and a few construction workers came in, laughing and talking loudly. Their normal, everyday lives contrasted sharply with the high-stakes corporate drama unfolding across the street. I felt a strange sense of detachment, like I was watching a movie from a comfortable seat. I knew exactly what was happening in the conference room. Gerald would be welcoming the Bradley executives, presenting them with glossy brochures and boasting about the company's state-of-the-art systems. Mason would be standing by the computer, trying to look confident but secretly terrified. At 9:10, I checked my phone. Still no messages from Gerald, but Julian's text arrived shortly after. The tension was building. I knew the script was performing its checks in the background. It was a simple piece of logic. If the system status is terminated and no override key is detected, initiate protocol 0. There were no exceptions, no delays, and no bypasses. It was the digital equivalent of a vault door closing and locking itself. At 9:15, the countdown reached 0. The system executed the commands, encrypting the databases, severing the virtual private network connections, and locking the terminal screens. The heartbeat of Erie Industrial Systems had stopped. I walked into the second-floor conference room to find absolute chaos. Mason was hunched over the keyboard, frantically typing with his tie loosened, while Gerald stood pale by the window. The 4 Bradley executives sat with arms crossed, looking furious. "You must be the legacy guy," one of them remarked as I entered. "Henry Vance," I replied, extending my hand. "Senior systems architect, independent consultant." I looked at Mason's. "Move over, Mason. The adults are talking." Mason scrambled out of the chair. I sat down and opened the command line terminal, the black box that Mason had mocked as archaic. My fingers flew across the keyboard, guided by years of muscle memory. I entered the 64-character encryption key that lived in my head. The red screen flickered, then turned green, and the simulation software loaded instantly. "System restored," I said, spinning the chair around. "Are you ready for your demonstration?" The room was silent. George Bradley, the lead executive, looked from Mason to me. "Let me get this straight," George said, his voice dripping with ice. "You fired the guy who knows how to turn the lights on, replaced him with your son, and then had to hire him back at 5 times his old rate to save your presentation?" Gerald opened his mouth, but no sound came out. "That is about the size of it. Mr. Bradley," I said, "shall we proceed?" For the next 90 minutes I owned that room. I explained the edge computing architecture, local logic processing for PLC controllers to avoid latency, and the multi-layered VLAN structure. I answered their technical questions with ease. George Bradley was extremely impressed. He stood up, buttoned his jacket, and looked at Gerald. "I have one question," George said. "Who is leading the implementation of this system if we proceed? Because frankly, Gerald, your new director of information technology just proved he does not understand the product you are selling. We walk unless we have a guarantee of technical competence." Gerald looked at me, his eyes begging me to save him. I looked at George Bradley. "I can guarantee the architecture, Mr. Bradley, because I built it. But as for the implementation, I am an independent consultant. My contract with Erie Industrial Systems ends the moment I walk out of this room today." George Bradley nodded, sliding his business card to me. "Then we have a lot to talk about, Henry," he said. The Bradley team packed and left without shaking Gerald's hand. Gerald turned to me, defeated. "You just cost us the contract," he whispered. "No, Gerald," I said. "I showed them the truth. You tried to sell them a racing car with a lawnmower engine. I just opened the hood." "We paid you," Mason shouted. "You were supposed to help us." I looked at the kid. "I did help you, Mason. I fixed the system you broke, gave the presentation, and saved you from violating federal laws regarding system integrity. I turned to Gerald. My invoice for $3,600 will be in your inbox today. I expect payment within 24 hours. I walked toward the door. Henry, wait, Gerald pleaded. We need to talk. He knew he had no choice. Mason could not run the system. I want you back, Gerald said, offering to rescind the termination with a salary of $90,000. I laughed in his face. I want a consulting retainer, I said. 20 hours a week maximum, remote work, reporting only to the CEO. Mason is not allowed to touch any admin systems, and my rate is $150 an hour. Gerald's eyes bulged. $150? That is over $150,000 a year for half the work. Actually, it is closer to $156,000, I corrected. And you save on benefits. If you say no, I walk, and you can ask Mason to fix the database tomorrow. Fine, Gerald snapped. I walked out with a signed agreement. Over the next 6 months, I formed Advanced Systems Integration. I came in 3 days a week, drank their coffee, and fixed what they broke. Mason was moved to digital marketing, where he could talk about synergy without crashing servers. 2 weeks later, George Bradley called. We decided not to move forward with Erie, he said. But we need our factory automated. We have budgeted $800,000 for the lead consultant role. Are you interested? I did the math. With Erie's retainer and other projects, I would clear $1 million in the next 2 years. My retirement was now whenever I wanted it to be. That evening, I sat on my back porch with a cold beer, watching the sunset. They had tried to throw me away, to erase 28 years of loyalty. But they had forgotten the fundamental rule of technology. Hardware is cheap, software is replicable, but experience is the only thing you cannot download. I raised my bottle to the sky and smiled.